For this session, we're going to learn about external CSS. We're going to start by putting in our basic HTML skeleton. I'm going to go ahead and save this as to a root folder that I've saved on my desktop, or I've created on my desktop. I've got a folder that I've just made called external CSS, and I'm going to save this inside of that as index.html. Now, we've learned previously that you can put CSS up here in the head of your document. Let's see, I've got a missing slash there. Typically, we will start learning CSS by placing it right up here in the head of our document in something called the style tag. So we could do something like this, and we could place a bunch of CSS here. And with this method, it's not really an incorrect method, but it's sort of an inefficient method. One of the beautiful things about CSS is that you can often modify it, and it will modify every page of your website. With the method that we're looking at here, where the CSS is all written in the head of the document, that will only change this one page. So there's a huge benefit of placing all of your CSS rules in its own external file. We'll actually save this file as a .css file, and it'll be saved in our root folder. In order to see this work, we'll have to actually have one line of code in replace of this where we'll link to it, and it's actually called a link tag. Now, in order to see how this works, I'd like to go ahead and drop in some of the old CSS that we learned with one of the last sessions and see how it applies, and then we can sort of strip it out of here and put it in its own file. So in order to do that, I need to copy a paragraph or two. I'm going to run out to lipsum.com and I'm going to copy a couple of paragraphs. Copy. I'm going to paste it down here in the body tag. And just like we did in a previous lesson, I'm going to drop a paragraph tag around this. And I'm going to put class equals, and I'll call this para1. This will be my first paragraph style. I'll drop in a closing p tag down here at the bottom, and I'll do the same thing here on the second paragraph. P class equals para2 with a closing paragraph tag. Okay, I've got two paragraphs, both in a paragraph tag, each one with a CSS class of para1 and para2 respectively. Now, before, we would write the CSS right up here, and we would say .para1. We might drop in something like font, family, Tahoma, and font size is 18 pixel. And then for para2, I'll say .para2, do something similar. Font, family, courier, font size, we'll make this pretty big, 24 pixel. Now, if we save this and look at this in our browser, we should see that we have two text paragraphs, each with its own respective style. Now, I'm going to save that. I'm going to look at this in my own browser, so you can do that depending on if you're Mac or PC. The process is a little bit different. But when I look at this in a browser here, I'm seeing that this is written in Tahoma, and it's a large font, about 18. This is obviously a different font. That's Courier, and it's bigger than that, so looks like that's working correctly. Now, all of this is in one file called index.html, and I want to separate these. I would really like to keep the HTML in the HTML file and the CSS in a CSS file. Now, here's how this works. You no longer need the style tag, so I'm actually going to delete the style tag right out of there. We don't need that anymore. I'm going to cut all of this CSS code out. So it might be 4 lines of code, 8 lines of code, or 800 lines of code. All of your CSS is coming out of there. So I'm not going to just delete it. I'm actually going to cut it. because I'm going to paste it here in a few moments. I'll go to File, New, and let me move this over a little bit. This is going to be my new window where I'll paste this. I'm going to reformat this just a little bit so it doesn't look quite as crazy. And this is going to be my CSS file. Now, the only special thing I need to do to make this into a CSS file is just to do a regular old save as. So if I go to File and Save As, first and foremost, I have to save it to that root folder. So I'm going to find that folder I made earlier called External CSS. It's where my index is saved. And I'm going to call this something like style.css. This should be a fairly generic file name. A lot of people call it style or style sheet or layout or something like that. This is going to be a list of all of your CSS rules. It's not just like para 1 or para 2. It's going to have all of them. So you may have 100 different CSS rules in here, and this is going to be a list of each and every one. So I'm going to name it something generic. Style.css works fine. I'll save that. Depending on which text editor you're in, you'll probably get a little bit of color coding. I'm in Text Wrangler on a Mac, and you see it sort of color codes itself. Let me make this font a little larger for you. So it color codes that font. Didn't do anything special besides save as to make that happen. Now, and I've got all the CSS saved here. Back in my index on my other tab here, I've got all of my HTML. Now we have to find a way to make them talk. And it's one line of code to connect them. It's a rather long line of code, but it is just one line. It goes generally wherever you would put your style tag. That's going to be in your head of an HTML file, generally under the title. As long as it's in the head, that's really all that matters, but generally you're going to put it under the title. And it looks like this, link. rel equals style sheet. So give you a moment to type that out. And I'll explain a little about what each one of these means. This is the link tag. There is no closing tag to the link tag. Now, when you were learning about making links to other web pages or even your own pages or other websites, you're probably thinking, why do we have to use this A or anchor tag and href and all this stuff? Why not just make it a link tag? And the reason is there's already a link tag and it's used for other things. The link tag is generally used up in the head of the document, and it links to other files that you might need and want to include. It's sort of like whatever file you're linking to here, it's sort of like all the code in that file is going to be placed right here. It's going to load in this particular order. So the link tag is used to bring in other types of files, not just like web pages. So that's why we don't use a link tag for regular links. rel equals style sheet. This means basically relationship or relative to, but relationship as it compares to this page. So how does this style.css relate to this HTML? Well, it's our style sheet. Type equals text/CSS. This just sort of identifies what type of file it is, what language it might be, and so on. If you leave out rel equals style sheet and type equals text/CSS, typically it'll still work okay, but this is just proper etiquette. You're supposed to put this in there. This is the magic part. href equals style.css. href we've seen before. That's what we put in our anchor tags. This says hyperreference or hypertext reference equals. This is the file name of the CSS file we just saved moments ago. So when we're seeing href equals, whatever's after that in those quotes had better be the same thing we saved moments ago as that CSS. So if you saved yours as stylesheet.css, that's what it should say here. I saved mine as style.css. I can see over here on my tab. And that's what I'm typing there. Now I'll save this, And theoretically, when I look at this in a browser, nothing should change. I stripped all of the code out of here. I put it in its own CSS file, and then I linked to that CSS file. So when I save this, I'm going to look at this in a browser, and sure enough, nothing really changed. Here's sort of the before and the after. And even though we really don't see any differences between the two, that's not such a bad thing. That's actually a good thing because we want it to look the same. Now, just in quick summary, we like external CSS because now I can put this one line of code in all of the pages of my website, no matter how many pages are on my website. If I link to the same CSS, I can use para 1 and para 2. Now remember, we're going to use CSS ultimately to do things like create a layout, create columns and headers and footers. So it's bigger than just changing your font or your font size, your font color. It's really, really important that we have our CSS in an external file because it makes our life so much easier when we want to upgrade our site. It also helps us to stay organized. So even though it's possible to go ahead and put CSS rules in a style tag, you can absolutely put them and should put them in its own CSS file. Now, what if you do both? One last thought here. If you do both, the style tag overwrites the link tag. The link tag is going to give you sort of your the things that are going to happen all the way across your site. If you put para 1 inside of your CSS file, and then you also put a para 1 inside of a style tag right below this in the head, the style tag wins. That way, we can have para 1 or para 2 on every page of our website. But if we decided that one page should look a little different, we could redefine para 1 here in the head inside of a style tag, just like we did before, and the style tag would overpower, it would trump what's on this link tag. And that's really the cascading part of cascading style sheet. That means that we can sort of rewrite the same rule multiple times, and you can actually have one more powerful than the other. So external style sheets, I do that professionally with every site that I do now. Rarely do I ever do a style tag up in the head, but it's very important that you understand that external style sheets are really the way to go. So that concludes this session. We'll talk about CSS some more, I'm sure, in the future. Thanks for listening.